to episode 36 of the Bible Connection podcast. So this is it's a weekly podcast. It follows our church's Bible reading plan that we might encourage you not to give up on reading your Bibles. My name is Josh Williams, and with me are a few of my good friends, Brandon Stooksbury.
Hey.
Taylor Babcock.
Hey.
And John Steinke.
Hello there.
So guys, this week we are discussing the first half of the book of Ezekiel. So in our episodes of Isaiah and Jeremiah, we discussed how God used both of those men to execute his covenant lawsuit against the people of Israel and Judah. So who is Ezekiel, and what role will he play in God's covenant lawsuit?
So if before we get into who exactly Ezekiel is, it's very important to understand that Ezekiel is following Isaiah, Jeremiah, and he is kind of the third in this covenant lawsuit against Israel as a whole. And I think that we should remember back in the Torah, it said, don't bring a charge against anyone except on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses, so that the case can be established. So Ezekiel is is in a sense acting as the third witness against Israel, and we saw last time in Jeremiah that the judgment on Israel, now we can see it as a divorce, right? And that this divorce is the sign of this divorce is the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, right? And so we can see that in this the bride of the Lord being struck down, this divorce happens, and there's a death, right? It's like there's a death happening, and what we're going to see in Ezekiel, his message is that the Lord is divorcing Israel. Israel has divorced themselves from the Lord, and in this divorce, they are symbolically dying. And what we're going to see is in the judgment, they're dying in these judgment passages, but there's hope, right? We'll see that there's hope in that Israel has died and they're going to be born again. They're going to be resurrected. We'll see that in chapter 37. But Ezekiel is an interesting guy. His name only basically appears in this book. And he is a king, or he's not a king.
Priest.
He is a priest and a prophet. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting. We see as it unfolds, as the book unfolds, we see that he's this priest and prophet. We see in here that he's married and his wife dies, and he's not supposed to mourn the death of his wife, but
silently,
yeah, and he's to go back to work in pronouncing judgment, and we think, well, that's harsh, but that's what God is doing, right? He's
very similar to what Aaron was expected to do when his sons had died.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but Ezekiel is kind of in the place of God, of Yahweh, right? As Israel, his wife is divorced and dies, right? He is to continue on, right? And that his role in continuing on as a prophet, there's going to be, Jesus even said, unless the seed goes down into the ground and dies, it can't basically bring forth into life, right? Israel is going to be resurrected, born again, and Ezekiel is the prophet of this death and resurrection, new heart.
I think a big part of explaining who Ezekiel is also talking about his context in history. So Ezekiel was one of the young men that was taken into exile before the temple was destroyed, which, if you think about it, it's like, well, why did that happen? Well, Jerusalem was destroyed, right, I'm spacing on the date, 586 BC, right? Yes, 586 BC. That's when Jerusalem was finally destroyed. The temple was destroyed in Jerusalem. But he was carried away by Babylon much before 586. It was in 597, which, if you remember, you count backwards in BC, means 11 years before the temple was even destroyed and the city was destroyed. He was already being taken away from the city into exile. So how does that work? Well, Babylon was a big, big empire. And Jerusalem was basically at that point so weak in those days, it was basically a city trying to make it, in the hills of Judah. So imagine the might of the United States of America trying to conquer Knoxville. It's basically like a looming threat. It's going to come down on you. And so the people were trying to take bribes to Egypt and ask Egypt if they would defend them. They were trying to make deals with Babylon. And in one of the threats that was given, they would take the young men, the skilled, the talented, the intellectual, the high-class men out of the city and carry them into exile even before the temple was fully destroyed. And so Ezekiel is prophesying about the things that are happening in Judah, but he's not in Judah. He's in Babylon. And we even know where by a specific canal. You can see the Chebar Canal in the first few verses of chapter 1. And so it's important to recognize that Ezekiel is a priest without a temple to serve in, right? He's a priest in exile, and he's 25 years old when he's taken away, and he's 30 years old when he's beginning this ministry of prophecy that God gives him. And so I think it's important for us to see that as we're thinking about how Ezekiel is reacting to the things he sees, how he's explaining the things he sees. And it gives us a little bit more perspective on what's happening in each vision when we recognize he's not in Jerusalem. He's hearing news from Jerusalem and prophesying with the visions that God's giving him all the way in Babylon.
Yeah, and Jeremiah is still like prophesying during Ezekiel's time, right?
For a little bit. Ezekiel continues to prophesy for at least 15 to 20 years after Jeremiah is done writing and has been taken into Egypt in exile.
Okay, gotcha. All right, so the first chapter of Ezekiel might be one of the most wild opening chapters in the Bible. Even Ezekiel, at the end of his vision, sat there overwhelmed for 7 days at what he experienced. So what is going on in this chapter 1 and 2, and how should we interpret what we read here?
First of all, let me get into the second half of your question. How do we interpret this? I would encourage you to, as you're reading this, underline everywhere where it says, like the appearance of. He says it's like flaming metal. The wheels are, there was an appearance of wheels within the wheels. There was eyes. Every time where you see likeness or the appearance of, Ezekiel's straining for vocabulary. We should interpret this. The worst thing we can do is interpret this literally, right? And say, this is exactly what he sees. Ezekiel is clearly saying, this is not exactly what I'm seeing. Mm-hmm. I don't have categories to explain what I'm seeing, right? And so therefore, just like with the book of Revelation, Revelation 1:1 tells us that we should interpret the book symbolically, right? Ezekiel is starting off with this strange vision and letting us know, I'm doing the best I can here.
He's trying to impress like the seriousness of these visions that he's having.
Yeah.
And being as descriptive as he can.
Yeah. And as he's beginning this book, he's beginning it with the irony of judgment that is coming upon Yahweh's judgment that is coming upon his nation and his temple. And what does that mean? Where is God's if the temple and the tabernacle before was how God revealed his glory, his Shekinah, where is God's glory going to be if it's destroyed? Where is it going to be where is God's glory going to be? Where is his name going to be if the people are scattered? What's going to happen? What does this look like? And the best he can do is explaining to the exiles, hey, God's presence is going out of Jerusalem, right? It's going out and it's going into the world. It's on the move, right?
So I think what's really helpful here also in trying to understand Ezekiel's vision is not to, when I first read this, I spent hours and hours just combing over the first chapter repeatedly and just trying to be like, what could this picture mean? What could this analogy be? What does it mean that's in the likeness of a wheel? And my mind's going all over the place trying to picture what this could be. And finally, I continued reading Ezekiel and I read the entire book, and I see that the book of Ezekiel unfolds and continues to build on this picture, and it helps to explain itself. So rather than trying to just, what does this mean to me? What could I make from it? Allowing Ezekiel's visions to continue as they did in his day allows us to see this picture. So we have, these four, creatures with human face and an ox face and an eagle face and a lion face and wings, and there's wheels and there's a platform, and then above a platform there's a chair. What is going on? Well, one easy picture, like a mental picture to develop as you read this imagery, is to think of a divine throne as a chariot. Because what's going on here is the Lord in his glorious presence. We've seen a little picture of it in Isaiah chapter 6, where his presence is like a king, right? Over all of the cosmos. His divine presence as a throne is about to leave, right? And if you could imagine the craziest, most tricked out car you could ever imagine, right? It's going to be big, it's going to be fancy, it's going to be loud. It can't rival what Ezekiel's going through, right?
I immediately thought of the show Pimp My Ride when you said that.
But the
Want to get rid of that
the thing
memory.
about this picture is you might be saying, okay, I can kind of see it when you say it that way, but how do I know that's what it is? How do I know that John's not just coming up? If you go to chapter 11, God is going to get into his chariot, and he is going to leave the temple that was in Jerusalem. And so what's interesting, when you get to the first chapter of Ezekiel, he is in Babylon. He's in exile. He's as far from the temple as he can be within his day, but God's glory reaches him. God is going to go into exile with his people. And it's the first thing we see before Ezekiel's even commissioned to be a prophet for God. God is making it clear to him that he is not, Solomon said, can God really dwell in a box? No, the heavens and the highest heavens cannot contain you. God is not going to be absent from them because of their exile, but he's going to be present and near to them and continue to bring his truth into their lives.
Yeah, and go ahead.
We'll definitely see that in the coming books that we're going to talk about, like Daniel, God's presence being in exile.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, great point. In chapter 10 is what you're describing, the glory of the Lord leaving the temple. But in chapter 10, verse 18, it said, "The glory of the Lord went out from the threshold of the house and stood over the cherubim, and the cherubim lifted up their wings and mounted up the earth before my eyes. And as they went out with the wheels beside them, they stood at the entrance of the east gate of the Lord, and the glory of the Lord of Israel was over them." Mm-hmm. It's literally picturing Yahweh riding this chariot. And as you remember, what the Ark of the Covenant looked like. There were cherubim on the top of it with their wings facing forward, mm-hmm. right? And the mercy seat was on that, and the picture of God's presence, right? Remember we talked about in Kings that the symbol of God's presence is never the prison of his essence, mm-hmm. right? So this is God is doing this, Yahweh is doing this to show that his presence is with them. And that's over and over 72 times Ezekiel is told that they may know that I am the Lord. And that's another interpretive thing with the book of Ezekiel. We need to understand that the word know here doesn't mean a knowledge of. To know, Adam knew his wife and they bore a son, right? Even in the New Testament, Joseph did not know Mary until after she bore Jesus, right? Knowing, to know means to have a relationship with, or in this case, follow in the statutes of. Right, that's what's implied here. Not just a head knowledge of the Lord, that they may follow the Lord. So,
and you look up pictures of this vision. I'm looking at one right now. There's some really weird stuff out there.
It's aliens, Taylor. It's aliens.
I know. So a lot of the stuff's weird.
Aliens,
but one thing, one of the things I always try to do in this passage, but I think you can apply it to anywhere, is know who it is. So this is Ezekiel. I think John mentioned earlier that he's about 30 years old when he's getting this vision. That's actually the same time that a priest would be appointed to service. Mm-hmm. So he's getting this vision at the time when there is no temple, when he would have been appointed service, and he's communicating to a people who are in exile in Babylon that have a baseline understanding of a lot of these concepts that they've been taught from the scriptures. So a lot of this language, there's a lot of picture ideas that are familiar to the Israelites that and I'm not going to try to explain these, but as you're trying to connect the dots of them, don't look at them in modern day. Well, this is what whatchamacallit looks like, or this is what this looks like. But try to understand it natively to how someone in that period in time who would have been reading this or hearing this would have understood it. And cherub, for example, it was very known and that cherubs pointed toward the presence of God, and specifically with Israel, the cherub on the Ark of the Covenant pointed toward the place of God's presence. So like when you read cherubim hymn, think the idea pointing toward God's presence, and you see the idea of God's presence. You see that more and more, and it unfolds later in the book. But these ideas need to be wrapped around in their native context. That I think you can go all the way back to Egypt with a lot of these that are paralleled through the rest of the scriptures. And you see some of that here.
So I think one of the things that's really crazy, and I might be going off on a little bit of a rabbit trail here, is that when he's being called at his 30th year into this role as prophet, he's being chosen as a priest because he's entering into the divine counsel of God. We've seen a few people do this, like Job was brought into the divine counsel of God at the end of his story, where God, basically takes him up and lays out his case before Job for why he does what he does. And ultimately, it's not the type of answer that Job is wanting. But the way he does it is very different than we see throughout a lot of the Old Testament. Rather than calling him out as a son of Aaron, well, the law of Mount Sinai, right, that covenant has now been stripped from them. They're in the midst of covenant divorce. He's not appealing to his priesthood as son of Aaron. He's calling him very repeatedly throughout the text, son of Adam. And so as we see this development of what was prophesied in the time of Jeremiah and Isaiah, the seed of the woman is now a stump, and from that stump, the shoot will come out of it. God is going to, in this new covenant, take all of the promises that he's given since the time in the garden and begin to restore creation. And in the end of Ezekiel, we're going to see the temple, which is, we've been talking about how that's a picture of the life-giving presence of God in the garden, and it's going to be bursting with garden-like imagery. And here, Ezekiel is being called into this preaching as a priest after the lineage of Adam. And I think that's going to be important for us as we're trying to tie all of these visions and pictures together.
When you say son of Adam, you're referring to in the text where it says son of man, son of Adam.
Yes.
Adam means
Same word used.
Yes.
Man, Adam, same word.
And it's a great way to think of that. If you've ever watched the Chronicles of Narnia, where the White Witch is asking, "Are you a son of Adam and a daughter of Eve?" When she sees the children first coming in out of the wardrobe, and it's appealing to that they're literally a son of man, that they're literally descended from Adam, that they're human. But again, there's the way that people have referenced who they're descendant from in the Old Testament has had very specific connotations. We are the sons of Abraham is something you've heard. We are the sons of Aaron. We are the son of Adam. So I feel like I'm getting too far of a tangent.
No. I mean, Jesus is the Son of Man as well.
Yeah. So in chapter 3, after his calling to prophecy on behalf of God, God calls Ezekiel to be a watchman for the house of Israel. What does this mean? What is a watchman, and what is God calling Ezekiel to do here?
It's not a fun job. Not a fun job at all. So the imagery of being a watchman, think about the person that's got to stay up in the night and watch out for the danger. But worse than that, God is basically guaranteeing to him, nobody's going to listen to you. So it's one thing to stay up all night knowing that you need to watch for the danger, but imagine knowing you're also going to be ignored. And so in the first portion of Ezekiel, we're going to see the first role of what a watchman would be, which is to alert and warn to the impending danger that could be coming. And ultimately, we're going to see that there's also a positive side to being the watchman, to know that you can also call out to the hope and the victory in battle, and to stir the people. And so we're going to see an optimistic conclusion to the prophecies of Ezekiel.
All right, so in the first half of the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel, like Isaiah and Jeremiah before him, pronounces judgment on God's people for their covenant failures. So what makes Ezekiel's judgment distinct from the other writing prophets?
Well, when we talk about the judgment that's going on in the book of Ezekiel, one of the interesting things that's going on that's a little different than what we saw before is the way that he's doing these symbolic actions in the judgment. And so what we got from Isaiah and Jeremiah, we got some descriptions and some imagery, but Ezekiel is actually acting out some very strange behaviors because he's not in Jerusalem.
Like eating his food over cow dung.
Poop.
Yeah,
Poop.
he
Human
is to
poop.
cook it. You can cook. This actually still happens in some places in the world that are very poor. It's not very good for greenhouse gases, but people cook their food with dung, right? Because it burns really hot.
When you mix it with the mineral content of like sodium, it gets much hotter than they could in any other capacity. And
so it allows you to cook certain meats that you couldn't get to a certain temperature.
Correct.
My point that I'm trying to emphasize here, though, is with all of these different acts that he's doing, he's not in Jerusalem. He's not like Jeremiah and Isaiah, who are living in the land and looking forward with these poetic descriptions of judgment. He's in exile, receiving visions in real time of the suffering that's going on in Jerusalem and relaying it to the other exiles around him, what's going on. And so he's doing these demonstrations, like literally he builds like a middle school diorama of Jerusalem, like a little
toy,
like a project. Yeah. And he starts like modeling out what's going on during the battle and the siege. And he lays on his side and is bound up and is for over a year. I don't mind eating my food cooked in poop compared to literally being tied to my side and laying there for over 390 days. And it's representing what's going to be going on in Israel as they're going to be taken captive and they're going to be under this judgment. And so it continues with all sorts of parables and allegories that are symbolizing the unfaithfulness and idolatry of the people. And then he starts unpacking it with this really rich language that, we keep talking about this covenant lawsuit. In chapters 14 through 23, he's going to be making very specific arguments against the people of Israel about how they have failed against God and have not kept his commandments, to the point where even if they were turning around and repenting, it's too little too late and judgment is coming.
And I would highlight, I'm drawing from Jim Hamilton's book, God's Glory and Salvation Through Judgment. Throughout the Isaiah, Jeremiah, and then now into Ezekiel, there's a lot of similarity in the judgments, the judgment oracles that are given. That intermixed through these judgment oracles, there is hope of this new covenant mentioned, the everlasting covenant, the covenant of peace that's interspersed through here. And as we're told about these, we're ultimately going to see in chapter 36, which we'll get into in the next episode. All of these are foreshadowing the kind of heart of the book in 36, but that we're going to see in Ezekiel. Ezekiel's going to highlight. So we need to picture this whole scenario as like a tapestry, right? Tapestry of this great picture that God is painting, right? And Isaiah has colored his with the colors that he has. Jeremiah came in colored with the colors that he has, and now Ezekiel is coming in and coloring with the colors that he has. And one of the colors that we see that Ezekiel is adding to this is we've seen God's presence, but specifically His Spirit. His Spirit is going to come into His people in this new covenant. That the Spirit is going to come into the people, and that will cause them to walk in His statutes. So it's it's a very rich picture that we see that similarities and differences of the judgment text of Ezekiel.
Throughout history, when God's temple was destroyed and a people were conquered, it marked the end of a religion. So in God's presences, if God's presence has left the temple in Jerusalem and his people were conquered by Babylon, why do we not cease worshiping God? Did he fail in his covenant promises to his people?
So this is a serious problem if you are a Jew, right? If you're a Jewish person who is trying to practice the law of Moses and the temple is destroyed, how do you worship God? What are you going to do? And this is before we received all of the explanations we got from the book of Chronicles, where we see David is re-imaging what's been going on in temple worship and giving them a picture of how to be faithful covenant community back in the land. Not that David is writing Chronicles, but they're picking up on David's language. When you come to the destruction of the temple in 586, the issue of worshiping God rightly is so difficult that by the time you get to the time of Jesus, it looks radically different than anything you saw in the Old Testament. I was writing a Sunday school lesson for kids recently and talking about what is a Pharisee. Pharisees didn't exist in the Old Testament. The cultures and traditions that Jesus was arguing against in his day, they were born out of the question, what do we do if God's not dwelling in his house? When you get to the book of Ezra, we talked about the anticlimax of the fact that the temple was built and God's presence did not pour down onto the temple. Again, God's presence left on this divine throne chariot and did not return until Jesus himself walked into the temple to cleanse it. And so the people are left with this problem of what to do, but Ezekiel isn't. Ezekiel recognizes that God has followed his people who obey him and love him into exile. And so we see in chapter 16, verse 59, thus says the Lord, I will deal with you as you have done, who have despised the oath in breaking the covenant, yet I will remember my covenant with you in these days in your youth. I will establish for you an everlasting covenant. Then you will remember your ways and be ashamed of when you took your sisters, both you and your elder and younger, and I give them to you as daughters, but not on account of the covenant with you. I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall know that I am the Lord. The Lord has not failed in his covenant promises. The people have failed in theirs. And this problem occurs again, Brandon was talking about before the podcast, after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. The temple was destroyed after the New Testament concluded. The temple was destroyed, and today Jews cannot offer sacrifices in a temple. There is no temple in modern day Judaism. They cannot offer sacrifices to God like it says in the book of Leviticus. And they've had to go through extraordinary measures and rethinking about the way they practice their religion in order to make sense of how do you follow the law of Moses without a temple. Obviously, we as Christians know through Christ, right? And so this question of why do we not cease worshiping God is because God has been faithful. God demonstrated that faithfulness. He demonstrated his continuing presence. Like you mentioned before, he's going to show his life-giving presence is going to be available to the people that have faith, even in exile, with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepping into the fire.
Very active.
Very active. His presence is going to be there in the lives of the people who have trust and faith and hope in him.
I think you could also go back to the whole point of the temple was to show God's presence. And when you look at Israel, and when we look at the promises made all the way back to Genesis, this picture of a temple, not Genesis, Exodus, this picture of a temple is to communicate where God is amongst his people. It's not meant to be the permanent solution for all time. The temple that we see in Jerusalem, the tabernacle, these are just pictures that are relatable to the audience, Israel, and conceptually for them to understand who God is, where he's at. He's among them. That tripartite structure was just a way to communicate where he was.
Tripartite meaning three spaces.
Three-space temple.
The Holy of Holies, the holy place, and the outer court.
So the temple was familiar to them. They were in Egypt. They understood that, and they come out, and then God communicated himself through that idea, but the idea was not the permanent resolution. And the permanent resolution, we are looking toward a new covenant. So this is just a stepping stone in order to communicate what is ultimately to be fulfilled. And so when you look at other cultures and their temple is overtaken, that is kind of the end game for them. That's what they are all about. God of whatever culture that is in that particular temple. But this is not the end game, and it's just a stepping stone to communicate a bigger picture.
Yeah, and one thing I would draw your attention back to chapter 20. In the question is, did he fail in his covenant promises to his people? I would encourage you to look at chapter 20, verse 33. And this is one of those, what I was saying, interspersed in the judgment text, there's hope that is built into these judgment texts, and we should kind of picture as the chariot of Yahweh is moving out of Jerusalem. There is God's presence and blessing and God's judgment and cursing. Right? We saw that there's coals that are coming from that chariot raining down and judgment, but also there's hope of restoration. In chapter 20, verse 33, it says, as I live, declares the Lord, surely with a mighty hand and outstretched arm, with wrath poured out, I will be king over you. Yahweh as king. We saw this in Isaiah, also in Jeremiah. Yahweh is king, even in exile. Right? I will bring you out from the peoples and gather you out of the countries where you were scattered, with a mighty hand and outstretched arm, with wrath poured out. I will bring you into the wilderness of the people, and there I will enter into judgment with you face to face. And then also we see later on it's wild, because in this, as God is reestablishing Israel, I would argue that the new Israel, the church, it says that I will put David my servant over you. And you're like, wait a minute, David died a long time ago. How is David going to be put as king over you? Well, it's the new David, right? Jesus is our king, right? And so it's really, really awesome how Ezekiel unfolds in this.
And when we think of it in those terms, it almost seems ridiculous that the destruction of a building could mean that we should stop worshiping God. It's a little bit like, if you had credit card debt and you just cut up your credit card with a pair of scissors, it's like, oh no, they can't make me pay it back now. It's all gone. It is not just a symbol. It is an instrument by which you accessed that debt. That the temple was more than a symbol. It was also the calling location of the people to engage in worship on God's terms. But it doesn't mean that when it was destroyed that God has somehow been defeated or neutralized.
Failed.
Yeah.
All right, so that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Bible Connection podcast. I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who took the time to listen this week. We hope this podcast equips and encourages you as you read. So if you would leave a comment on YouTube if you had any questions, or you can just send us an email with a question to the email on screen. I hope you have a blessed day, and we'll be back with episode 37.